Today, we have host of the No Ad, No Problem, John Parsons, one of the biggest insiders of college tennis, joining on this channel today to talk about the 2024-2025 college tennis season. Now, this is a little bit of a too early to predict episode, but we wanted to bring John back on as a recurring guest to talk about this upcoming season, looking back at the Battle of the Bay, looking towards the ITA All-Americans, looking at the new NCAA individual format, and so much more. Make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on. We just hit 5,000 subscribers. We can't wait to see when we can get to 6. So make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on. And now enjoy our chat with John Parsons for your 2024-2025 college tennis preview. John, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for doing this on a Sunday, no less. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I always know when I get the invite, we are rearing to go for college tennis. So it means that we are in an exciting time of the year.
And I couldn't start with something more exciting than what was happening in San Francisco. Let's start there because we had, in my mind, I don't know if you're thinking it as well, but Carl Overbeck from Cal won this year's men's and singles and doubles, I should say, titles for their program. And I just wanted to start there on the men's side. What did you expect going into this? And was it anything that went the way you thought it would?
Well, first, I just want to talk about what is the Battle in the Bay, and
Absolutely.
this is a really great tournament that's hosted in San Francisco at the California Tennis Club. Historically, it's been hosted by the University of San Francisco, but unfortunately, that school has cut their men's and women's tennis programs. So I was really thrilled to see that this was continue back on the schedule this year, technically hosted by Cal.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes this event so great is one, the California Tennis Club is a really cool venue. It's a private club. And so the dining room and the pro shop, it all sort of surrounds the main bank of courts. You can be sitting in the dining room with a full view of the main court. So that's always special. They have a great PA announcer. They have ball kids as well, which you don't often see at the collegiate level. And the winner of this event on the men's side, if we want to start there, gets 2 wild cards into ATP Challenger events. They're split a little bit differently based on how far you do in the event. But in this case, Carl Overbeck of Cal won both of the wild cards. He'll receive entry into the Challenger in Tiburon and then the Challenger in Fairfield, assuming he can play. Mm-hmm. So as an event, this is a really special event on the calendar. Players get to come out west. They get housed by families who live in beautiful homes in Pacific Heights with great views. So it's a really special event. And I was really impressed with Overbeck's level from Cal. You typically get a really good field here. We did have the men's #1 player, Ozan Barris, here from Michigan State, who Overbeck beat in 3 sets. Mm-hmm. And he is someone that wasn't necessarily Overbeck, that is a heralded junior. He only reached about 250 in the ITF junior rankings, but he is taller, has a really big game, huge serve, huge forehand, very comfortable coming to net, very comfortable in doubles. And it feels like it's taken him a while to really settle into that game style, but he was clicking on all cylinders there in San Francisco. It helped to have a little bit of a home field advantage for sure, but I was really impressed with his level, and I think he's someone to watch as we continue on in this fall season.
And looking back at what Carl was able to accomplish last year, he didn't even break the top 100 of the ITA rankings last year. Am I correct to say that?
Yeah, and when he played #1 for Cal, it was like a 5-5 record. So it wasn't necessarily like a world beater last season. So he's really shut out of the gates here at the Battle in the Bay.
And it's not the first time he won doubles either. He's won it twice before, I believe, with a former teammate in 2021 and 2022. So he's not three-peated, but he's won the tournament 3 times for doubles, but first time winning in singles. And a guy that's 6'4", to come out, not drop a set, I believe, all tournament except to Ozan, is quite a feat, to be honest. Now that the Pac-12 is dissolved, essentially, who knows at this point when it comes to realignment. But for Cal to have this kind of success out of the gate and to have players like Carl already showing promise, it really makes you wonder what you can expect from this Cal's team in the 2024-2025 season.
Yeah, they're going to be one to watch, right? We now have Chris Quinta, the former associate head coach at USC, now coaching Cal. He's now been there for a few years,
Hmm.
able to put his fingerprint on that program. And it hasn't been a great start. You know, they've
Hmm.
still been in the 40s, the 60s
Hmm.
ranking range, but clearly Overbeck is playing great tennis. They've brought in some transfers, some freshmen, and they have a whole new conference ahead of them. They're going to have a lot of travel this spring season going out to the ACC schools on
Hmm.
the East Coast. But
Hmm.
yeah, I would certainly look at Cal as a program to watch, particularly if Overbeck does take that leap to be one of the more dominant number ones.
I agree, but with the 5-5 record, is last year at the 1 and 1 and 2, I believe, at singles two. He was mainly successful in doubles last year, going 10-4, going 4-0 at the two spot. So for him to kind of have that is quite incredible. And during that draw, did you, besides Carl, was there any surprises to you, at least on the men's side, that you thought this is not how I expected it to go?
Well, I certainly didn't have those on Barris losing that early,
No.
but certainly Overbeck. I mean, Barris had made the final last year. I think he actually won this tournament last year.
He
He was the
won
defending champion. Yeah.
22-3.
Yeah, so I didn't have him losing that early. There was a good showing from UCSB. They had a men's player in the semifinalists, and
Hmm.
typically you don't see them have that deep of runs on the men's side. Amelia Honor on the women's side has always made deep runs here. So I was impressed with UCSB. Kenta Miyoshi of Illinois was
Hmm.
the consolation winner. I thought he was playing really great tennis. So there were a few new names, I would say, that were popping up in later stages that you don't typically see. Overall, I thought it was a really great tournament.
And if we look at the women's side for this tournament, the first thing before we get to the winner on the single side, the double side actually kind of involves both. But Oklahoma State women just seems to not, ironically, I'm wearing this shirt. Um, but the women's side of it, they look like they're ready to resume what they accomplished in 2023, 2024. I mean, winning doubles. I believe it was Ange Obi Kajuru who made the finals in singles, but had to pull out due to an injury. But this Oklahoma State team, number one in the rankings, as preseason rankings, I should say, as well. What does this mean for them, at least as a team, and for these two players? Because I feel like, again, it kind of is proving the point that Oklahoma State women's team is the one to beat, or their players are the ones to beat this season, or this coming season, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, Kajuru and Komar have been one of the best doubles teams in the country since they started playing together last year when they
Mm,
both transferred into Oklahoma State. So it's not a huge surprise that they make a deep run here in San Francisco. Their game styles complement each other really well. Komar, the taller of the two, the bigger serve. Kajuru, just sort of like the consistent, aggressive baseliner. They complement each other really well. They've now been playing together consistently. A lot of times in these fall tournaments as well, coaches are going to be mixing up pairings. And so you might
mm,
have players competing who have never played together. And so having that consistency, making a deep run in NCAAs last year, did Komar and Kajuru, that experience will pay off really well at one of these fall tournaments. And I think they have a chip on their shoulder, right? They
mm.
go through undefeated last year until they lose in the round of 16. Komar Kajuru were the anchors at the top of that lineup last season. They have more to prove this season, and it started by taking the doubles title here.
Ange made the singles final, correct?
Yes.
And she pulled out. Did she disclose the injury?
I'm not aware of the injury. She played the
Okay.
doubles final earlier in the day. I'm not sure if she tweaked something in the doubles final and maybe it
Mm,
was preventative, knowing that we had All Americans coming up, but I didn't see anything that was noticeably like acute, like a rolled
okay.
ankle or something like that.
Okay. And maybe going on to the Georgia player Anastasia Lapata, and correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but Georgia women seem to always produce one standout player or more than one standout player when it comes to singles players on the women's side. And Anastasia is kind of a proof in the pudding with her run at Battle of the Bay.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely have a few players this year and last who could make deep runs in individual events. Lapata played number 4 for the Georgia team last season, and she went on to
Mhm.
make the NCAA singles final. We
Mhm.
didn't see her at all this summer, didn't play any pro tournaments, didn't see any action from her, but for
Mhm.
her to show up here in San Francisco and continue her form from making the NCAA singles final was very impressive. I mean, she is her defense is just incredible.
Mhm.
And she's very fun to watch in that regard because you have a lot of players trying to figure out how do you beat someone that anticipates so well, gets so many balls back, and gets them back likely pretty deep in the court. And seeing different players try different game styles against her is always a fun game of chess. But yeah, I don't know where she's going to play in this Georgia lineup. It's going to be something really interesting to follow.
What would be the safest bet to put her at based on their strong lineup?
So, for those that don't know the Georgia program as well, they have
Mhm.
Dasha Vidmanova, who is the number 2 player in the country right now in the preseason rankings. They have Alexandra Vekic, who is actually the highest ranked WTA player in college right now. She is up there in like the mid 400s. And then they had Mel Riasco at number 3. I would say right now, I would assume both Vidmanova and Vekic are going to play higher than Lapata in the spring season. Riasco appears to be injured, so we saw her this summer in a boot. She's not playing the All American tournament, so I would say right now you might expect to see Lapata play above Riasco at number 3. Just she's clearly healthy, she's clearly playing well.
Mhm.
I would assume maybe she stays there, but Riasco's a senior. She's played as high as 1 for that Georgia lineup, so that top 4 is incredibly strong for Georgia.
I agree. And seeing what Dasha accomplished last year as well is another feat that Georgia has to this program. And they have a lot of good players this year, including did you mention Mert as well?
I didn't, but you want to talk about her, you can.
Yeah, it's another one that's huge into the program and only as a sophomore right now has more potential than maybe some of the others uh in the women's game right now in college.
Yeah, I would make the comp to the player we've talked about in Cal's Overbeck, where Mert clearly a very strong doubles player. I mean, she
Hmm.
just won the NCAA doubles title with Vidmanova as a freshman,
Hmm.
and she hits a really big ball. And I think translating that half court play where she's
Hmm.
comfortable coming to net, comfortable hitting a big ball to the full court in singles. Singles results have been a little shaky, probably not as consistent as Georgia is looking for, particularly if she's going to play lower in the lineup. But
Hmm.
moving forward, she's a player that you need to build around. She's only a sophomore. You have a lot of other more senior players on this team, and her upside is really high.
I totally agree. And I just remembered, I wanted to circle back more about the tournament itself for the Battle of the Bay. Is Battle of the Bay is one of the tournaments where you get to see players from different schools play with each other for doubles, which is rare to see in college tennis, but something that I thought we would see more of, at least now and in the future, because I think it's just another way of kind of creating that college, quote unquote, college tennis tour where they're competing for themselves and for the school. So I personally think that's one of the perks of playing this tournament is to play with people you know from other schools to kind of compete for that championship in this tournament.
Yeah, that one is interesting because there's not a lot of upside for a coach to pair one of your players with
Hmm.
a player from a different school,
Okay.
because you're not going to be playing with them in the dual
The whole
season. So
year.
I don't think coaches love that. I think oftentimes that comes in a situation of need where, hey, we'd
Okay.
love for this player to play doubles. Does anyone else have a player? Where
Hmm.
I thought you were going to go with this is so Battle in the Bay offers 2 wild cards. They give
Hmm.
the wild card to the singles tournament winner, so
Hmm.
Overbeck, and then they do a really fun event for the members at night. After the semifinals, they do what they call a tiebreak shootout,
Hmm.
where they take the 4 single semifinalists and they play a 10-point tiebreaker against each
Wow.
other. So they swap the semifinalists. So you play someone different than you played earlier in the day. And then in the
Okay.
finals, whoever wins that also receives one of the wild cards. I
Wow.
think what would
Okay.
make that, yeah, so it's a really fun event. It's short, right? It's compressed, and there's a lot of stakes on the line.
Yeah.
And it gives an opportunity for, even if you make the semifinals, you still have an opportunity to earn a really huge wild card
Yeah.
for these players. I think what would be awesome for that is to bring back a little mixed doubles.
Yes.
Now, I know there's no wild card that they could give
Yeah.
for the winner, but swap the semifinalists, like play the shootout and then do a little mixed doubles shootout,
Yeah.
because we've done that in the past. I think it's super fun. I think it's one of the rare things that college tennis could do more frequently that would bring
Mhm.
some intrigue and interest, and particularly in a fun environment like that. I'd love to see more of that.
I like that. And it kind of to make it like a grand slam for tennis as well. You always have singles, doubles, and then a mixed event essentially where you have someone from your own school that you're competing with and kind of have that same national championship pedigree at NCAAs. And segueing that to the next topic, which is your NCAA individuals and doubles, let's just say, going to the fall. This is the first time this is happening, and it's new, and there's mixed views on it. But I wanted to get your opinion on it before I start asking some questions that could hopefully answer some of the questions my audience has and people that are curious to know your opinion about it. So, to start off, what do you think of individuals moving to the fall? Because it's hosted by Baylor this year.
Yeah. So I did a deep dive on this on my podcast. So people can listen if they want like the full like nuts and
Oh,
bolts of how this thing is going to work. But
mhm,
a brief overview is that previously in May, we played the team singles and doubles championships all together.
mhm,
Now, what the NCAA has done is split out the singles and doubles championship, which will be played this November in at Baylor. And then
mhm,
in May, we will only have a team championship also at Baylor.
mhm.
So that's sort of the lay of the land. If you want to talk about like how players get in, I'm happy to answer those questions. I think my initial reaction has vacillated over the years since this has been announced. This was announced back in January of 2023. I think they've done a really good job of trying to make sure that players have an opportunity to compete. One of the big concerns was like, will the best players play? I
Mhm,
think right now I feel pretty confident that the best players will compete in
mhm,
this event, or at least have a pathway to get there. I think one of the downsides right now is we are in just such an environment of change, whether it's conference realignment, NIL, revenue sharing, where college tennis is on the back burner for a lot of those topics
yeah.
and not at the forefront. And so to introduce such a dramatic change to the way college tennis works probably doesn't help in terms of how it's seen within athletic departments. One of the major reasons for making this change was to clarify that the fall season is for individuals, the spring season is for team, and you don't have to like mix
Gotcha.
those together. So I'm going into this with an open mind. I think one thing that is exciting about this is sort of like the race to NCAAs.
Yeah.
But yeah, and there's a lot of pros and cons, and we'll have to see how it goes this fall.
So going off of what you just said and from what I'm curious to find out is if because one thing that we knew during the fall season, at least on the men's side and maybe the women's side as well, is during the fall, a lot of the men's players would go off and play challengers or ITF tournaments, which is now included in the calendar for the school's calendar. So they'll announce if they're playing ITF 15Ks, ITF 25Ks, maybe challengers if their players are that much better than the rest of the field. And same with the women. But now I feel like is this switch incentivizing players to play more college tennis during the fall and the winter before they pick it up back for, like you said, to focus on the team aspect in the spring.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest potential issues
Hmm.
where the way that college tennis was moving was that more and more players were taking the fall off. And
Hmm.
particularly on the men's side, if you're taking the fall off, meaning not just you're not playing college events, but you're also not enrolled in school, that was a great way for coaches to manage their 4.5 scholarships. Because if you're off playing, you're not enrolled in school, I don't have to pay for your scholarship.
Yeah.
So I could essentially tell my best player that they're on a full scholarship, but really I only have to pay a half of it because it's one semester that they're playing. So
Yeah.
it was like a load management tactic. And I think you saw a lot of players who have pro aspirations say, hey, I'm going to really try and build up my pro ranking in the fall. I'll play college in the spring, but when I enter in the summer, I'm not starting from scratch.
Yeah.
And so this change to sort of handcuffing a lot of these players to make a really tough decision meant that they had to make that tough decision. And what you're seeing is some of the top players are not competing in the fall. So notable absences this fall are Nishesh Basavareddy of Stanford, Jack Pennington Jones of TCU, Murphy Casone, Bor Artnik, both of Arizona State. In general, though, I think we used to see more. So I think
Yeah.
like last year, we probably saw like 8 of the top 20 maybe not play in the fall. So I do think you had more players need to make that choice this fall. In general, forcing their hand to play college events definitely felt ITA incentive, like they
Mhm.
have an incentive to do that,
Yeah.
but definitely was not the way that the college tennis system was going.
And that kind of answers my next question, which was, does this change the mindset for teams and players and coaches? Because obviously, now that they have individuals rather than focusing on that, building that program and building that future for them after the school year. And that's what a lot of college coaches say. Like, you want to come to this program, we can help you develop your skills to get to that next level, which is in a lot of the cases what they're trying to achieve. And you see that with programs like Michigan State with Ozon. You see that with Arizona State with Murphy. You see that at Texas with Spaziri that he did. You see all these programs that are trying to build their athletes to become pros and to help them to the next level of their career. But how are you supposed to achieve that now that they're, like you said, handcuffed to that incentive of the ITA is now and the NCAA is now working for the individuals to play more throughout the fall.
Yeah, and I would broaden it. This is not just for the tippy top of college tennis, because
Mm-hmm.
in general, a lot of coaches used to view the fall season as a full semester of development.
Mm-hmm.
And you had these fall tournaments to use as developmental pathways. But let's say you bring in a freshman, a lot of potential, but there's some major issues in his or her game.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, if you needed to take 6 weeks off to really hone, maybe it's a technique issue, maybe it's just fitness, right? You could feel comfortable doing that because
Mm-hmm.
it's not the worst thing in the world if you're missing a few fall events. Now, you really reinforce, like, you have to put that player out there. They want to qualify for NCAAs, and that might reinforce a lot of those technique or physical
Mm-hmm.
gaps that you'd like to work on. I think that's one of the things that coaches probably feel the most uncomfortable with, is just that there's now no period of development
Mm-hmm.
where you can say, hey, we need to make a massive change to this person's forehand technique. When in the calendar are you supposed to do that? In the
Exactly.
past, spring was the most important, so let's use the fall to do that. And now you can't really do that.
And so it's basically, when you recruit, you have to recruit. And it also comes down to recruiting in that sense, because you have to recruit guys that are ready to go the second they step on campus. Because if they want to play these individual tournaments, they want to play the big events in college, they have to be ready to go right out of the gate. So it's, and I think of it when, I guess, when I played in high school, tennis used to be just primarily a spring sport. Now every sport, no matter what, has become a 365-day a year activity, training, social life. And that's kind of what just happened with college tennis. It's now a full season rather than 6 months are the most dominant. Starting in January onwards is the most important time to play.
Yeah, and I almost thought it would be a good thing if
Mm-hmm.
college tennis like took some air out of the balloon a little bit in the fall season and almost de-emphasized the importance, because of that developmental time period that they need. Tennis as a sport is always one that typically has more year-round competition dates
Uh-huh.
than most other sports. Like most other sports, they might have a few months, a full semester, but then the rest of the semester is more about like fitness and training. Tennis has always been more year-round, but I thought it'd be helpful to kind of let a lot of these players choose their own pathway. That might be, hey, I'd love to be able to actually attend a college football game, but I
Mhm.
can't now because it's like every weekend I have to be playing some event. Or, hey, I'd like to be playing ITF events, but I can't because that conflicts with All Americans. And I think it's really tough to have this sport 24/7, 365 without any period of like sustained, uh, commitment on
Mm.
campus.
Yeah, and it comes down to that idea that it's more about just getting them to play consistently as a job rather than a student athlete. Again, because when we look at all the other sports like basketball, like football, like they have designated off time. Tennis has never had that designated off time. It's only designated when you want it to be. And this is kind of the problem that tennis has right now on the Pro Tour. They complain about
Yes.
how long the schedule is, and people that are not, as a rough count, top 150 that haven't made enough to maybe take a couple weeks or a couple months off before January in Australia hits. Now college tennis is hitting that point where I can't really afford to have a normal life anymore because now I have to prepare during the fall, during the winter, and then during the spring where I have to play my best for the team. So it's
Yeah.
it's getting into the nitty-gritty of, oh crap, now we're going to run into the same problem that pro tennis is having.
Yeah, and college tennis has always sort of been like that,
Hmm.
but you had the agency just to sort of shirk the norm, if you will,
Hmm.
right? Like All Americans, the ITA Fall National Championship, like the only downside of not playing those events was your ranking,
Hmm.
but most of those players would come back in the spring season, get enough ranked wins, and be able to make NCAAs. And so you had the agency to sort of decide what you wanted to do in that fall.
Hmm.
Now we've really codified this structure where we're trying to make the fall as important as the spring, which does mean that tennis, with regard to college, is like fully a year round sport because there are literally two NCAA championships that you're playing for, one that bookends the end of the fall and the other that bookends the end of the spring.
Exactly. And kind of going into that kind of full year concept with all these student athletes, the next part I wanted to talk about with you is the transfer portal, because we had a lot of movement this past off season, I should say, with transfers. And there are a couple names that I wanted to get to, but to give a brief idea of what the transfer off season was, it's a bit chaotic, to be honest. There was a lot of names that I did not expect to move, but at the same time, I did. What did you think of the transfer portal this offseason?
I actually felt like we were starting to hit more of an equilibrium with the
Really?
transfer portal, only because
Okay.
it was really the last year. We know, like, if you were a freshman in 2020, where you
Yeah.
were then granted the extra year of COVID eligibility, you're gone. Like, you've already played your 5 years.
You're
And
cut.
so this past year was a huge turnover. And you see that in the rankings, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but you see a lot of players. We basically lost two graduating classes last year.
Yeah.
And so what we started to see with the transfer portal was a little bit less of those fifth year COVID eligibility transfers and more of the like, I'm in the middle of my career and I'm transferring someplace else. And then we start to see more what I would consider like NIL speculation, like
Yeah.
the burst of the post COVID transfer portal. And we should say that the transfer portal in tennis has always been one of the most used transfer portals in college sports.
Yeah.
It's really other sports that have really taken off. Tennis has always been pretty consistent. We first saw this era of post COVID where it was like, I want to transfer somewhere because I want to win an NCAA title. You look
Yeah.
at Baylor in 2021, where they bring in players from Duke and Dartmouth to really solidify their bottom of the lineup.
Yeah.
Then we started to evolve to now it's more less about maybe winning an NCAA title and all about like NIL
Yeah.
speculation in terms of like how much money they might be making at another school. That usually goes hand in hand with winning an NCAA title. But in general, from a volume perspective, I think it was a little bit less this year. And particularly on the women's side, I don't
Mhm.
think we really saw as many big name transfers as we did on the men's side.
Let's start with the women because you just said that. What this may be a little extreme, but have you ever seen someone, because who I'm referring to is the University of Houston, and they're trying to change their program, but the amount of girls Houston took from Grand Canyon was basically, I'm going to just take my roster and just put a different color paint on it because she took like 4 or 5 girls with her.
Yeah, it was at least four. It it might have been more than that. And yeah, and you're referring to Coach Adamovich, who was the
Mhm.
head coach of GCU. She gets the job at Houston, which is now in the Big 12. And essentially, all of her starters transfer from GCU to Houston.
Yeah.
And the thing about that, though, is that is would not have been that uncommon prior to COVID. Like,
Yeah.
so that one to me is like that's a huge change, and certainly like really you feel bad for that GCU program that was like
Yeah.
on the come up and now is completely
It was strict.
starting from scratch. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But we've seen that before. I don't have any examples, but to go from particularly a non Power Four conference to go to a Power Four conference like she does with GCU to Houston, those players are going to be interested in making that move. And you see a lot of players typically follow their coaches like that. So that one wasn't shocking to me, although it's like it's a high volume for sure.
The high volume is the part that shocked me the most. And while you were explaining that too, the team that I thought that basically had to kind of start from scratch again was Iowa State.
Completely. Yeah, the difference there, and this was Iowa State, they make the Elite Eight in 2023.
Mhm.
Boomer Saya, the head coach there, takes the role at Clemson. He didn't take any players from Iowa State to Clemson, but all but one of those starting players from that Elite Eight team transferred. The
Yeah.
difference between this and the GCU Houston example is that they all sprinkled themselves to other different schools. You had
Yes,
Kajuru go to
exactly.
Oklahoma State. You had someone go to Baylor, right? Yeah, you had one player go to Miami. Like you had them dispersed throughout the
It
country.
wasn't like a clump that just went to
Yeah.
another place. They literally went to every other
Yep.
university that they could think of. Was there one transfer that surprised you the most, at least on the men's side, that you thought, wow, didn't expect him to go here, or one that you weren't shocked about?
I mean, the biggest transfer on the men's side, and I would say on any side this year, was Cooper Williams from
100%.
Harvard to Duke. Cooper
Yeah.
Williams was the freshman of the year last season, comes in this season as number 4 in the ITA rankings. What shocked me so much about this change is he'd only played 1 year at Harvard. And so he had gone through the recruiting process, not too far off, and had made the
Yeah.
decision to go to Harvard. And typically, when someone is making that decision, you know that Harvard does not have athletic scholarships. So you know that you're paying your own way. So typically, that biases towards players with families that can afford to do that.
Mhm.
And clearly money is not a huge part of your calculus because otherwise if you're Cooper Williams and money is a huge part of your calculus, you go to a school that's going to offer you a full athletic scholarship out of the gate.
Yep.
And so that stunned me because I felt like that calculus to choose a Harvard or a Duke could have been made just a year prior.
Yeah.
That was, I think, the biggest shock to me. And I'm sure you'll get into this, but that was really just the tip of the spear with the Duke men this year.
They took like they took everyone. They they
Yeah.
they literally took some of the best players because Cooper also wasn't, before we move on to Duke, Cooper wasn't the only one that transferred. Henry von der Schlunberg also transferred to Stanford.
Yeah. With that one, though, that is very common because
Yeah.
so all of these players that competed in during the COVID times
Yeah.
get an extra year of eligibility.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that the Ivy League did not play tennis in 2021.
Yes.
So that's basically 2 extra years. So the last remaining players using this like extra eligibility are in fact these Ivy League players. You see Alex Kotzen transferred to
To
Tennessee
Tennessee.
for his final year. And the thing about the Ivy League is they have a rule that says you cannot use your extra eligibility at an Ivy League school. So if they have extra eligibility and they want to use it, they have to transfer. That's why you have seen a lot of the Ivy League transfers go elsewhere for that extra eligibility because they had 2 years. They had to use
Yeah,
it somewhere. So the Henry von der Schulenburg was, I have an extra year of eligibility. I want to keep playing college tennis. He has to go somewhere and
yeah,
he can't stay at Harvard. Whereas Cooper, of course, could have just stayed at Harvard. He's not at all part of this extra eligibility.
exactly. And I mean, going back to Duke, where do you start? Because they took everyone.
Well, you start with Cooper Williams, right?
Yep.
And that's certainly the tip of the spear. I mean, he is going to be one of the best players in the country this year. And then I would say so they took 6 transfers overall. It took 6 transfers. They bring in 2 newcomers as well. It is a completely revamped team.
Yes.
I would say the 2 other transfers that are really, I don't say worth calling out, but the 2 other ranked transfers
Mhm.
are one Ripple from Arkansas, who is preseason number 47, and then
Yep.
Sam Landau of Indiana, who is preseason number 53. These are also notable to me because, like Cooper, these are not fifth-year transfers. They
Yeah.
are transferring. I think both are coming as juniors. I know Landau will come in as a junior, so they're not fifth years. So they're just within their college career. And I would say those 3 transfers for Duke are where you would start. And then they, of course, have 3 others, but there's like too many players to name, basically.
I mean, for them too, going into a now expanded ACC conference, it actually begs the question of, are they top 3 favorites that to win that division, or I should say conference, because you still have a lot of guys on in the ACC that could be considered a higher favorite against Duke. I mean, the one I would point out is Wake Forest. Like,
Yep.
same with
NCAA
Florida,
semifinalist.
same with Florida State that won the conference championship. Like,
Yep.
that was another surprise that a lot of people didn't see coming. And they won it. In a big factor was them moving indoors during the championships, but that's just another factor. So
Yep.
it's one of those that you're thinking, can they be that top dog of the ACC?
Yeah, and you're always going to have Virginia in the mix. I mean, they have a ton
Exactly.
of
Thank you.
turnover,
I can't
but
believe
they
I
bring
forgot
in a
Virginia.
massive freshman class as well.
Mhm.
I think the thing with Duke is I'm tempering my expectations on what this Duke team can deliver until we really see it. I think Duke as a program overall has sort of consistently under-delivered on the talent they have on paper. We also have a comp from Duke on the women's side where they brought in a lot of transfers. They brought in 2 Ivy League transfers. They brought in Cam Moore from UNC, and that didn't go amazingly well for them. I think what maybe gives me some hope for this Duke men's program is that they're not all fifth years, because I think in general the fifth years have been pretty overrated. I think you bring in a fifth year,
Okay.
they they're they're not turning pro. They don't really have aspirations of it. Their commitment and ties to the program are not that big. You're hard pressed, I think, to find a ton of fifth years who really have a better fifth year than they did their first through 4 years. So it's helpful for this Duke team that you have Cooper, Ripple, Landau, who are not fifth years. But that's a hodgepodge team right now. And you have to do a ton of work to really build the fabric and thread between those players to come up with a really cohesive team.
Mhm.
And they got a lot of work to do. And we'll have to see how they're looking this fall.
Well, you also have to remember that they also got Petrovic from Florida State as well, which was another
Yeah.
huge name that honestly I was surprised by, especially after having that successful year. But
Well, yeah, and he was like committed to Oregon, I think, and then
do,
changed to Duke. I
and
also don't know how these players are getting in to Duke. Like I understood when they were coming in as fifth years and they were doing
Yeah.
like a 1 year master's program. Like it was
But
like, okay, to come in as like undergrad, I mean, props to these players. Uh, but the Duke, they must have had a hard conversation with Duke admissions to let all of these players in because that is very atypical.
yes, but how do I put this without making people upset? When it comes to athletics and Duke, I feel like it's a different standard than Duke getting into Duke academics. And maybe
It,
I'm
yeah,
wrong to assume that, but the best example I could really, or that comes to the top of my head, is when you have a guy who committed to Harvard, like Cooper, as a freshman, he also had to get in on some merit. So I can understand like Duke going to Duke is a, a lateral move academically, maybe a little lower, but that's the only thing I can think of.
yeah, I mean, Cooper, I would not put in that bucket, right? I mean, to get
Mhm.
into Harvard with no athletic scholarships, like you have to be, I mean, yes, there's a slightly lower bar for admission for athletes, but like at these top schools, that bar is still pretty high. And so,
Yeah.
like, I have no doubts that Cooper close to meets basically their normal bar for admission. Like, that's not who I'm putting in this conversation.
Hmm.
A lot of the other players I think is unusual because Duke tennis is not Duke basketball. And even then, these admission standards at schools like a Stanford or a Duke are still very high.
Yeah.
And to take this many transfers as well, the volume of it is something that they must have had a hard conversation with on the admission side.
I, yes. Um, I can see that. I can see that. And another, I guess the one of the most interesting transfers was, and I'm sorry if I got my research wrong about this, but Gorsny to Texas after winning the national championship with TCU. How does one explain that to fans, especially because imagine this happens to an Ohio State and Michigan football player. Imagine if this happens to a Oklahoma and Texas football player. Like that's something you do not do when it comes to in-state rivalries, especially the team that you beat in the national championship game. How does that on a broad scheme on a broader scale, how does that affect college tennis or how it's looked at? Because that's wild.
Yeah, I mean, and not just his team beat them, he was literally the clinching point for TCU over Texas. And it comes out a few days later while we are still in Stillwater that he is
Mm,
transferring to Texas. There's a few different ways to look at this. I think the general consensus is that Gorsny is someone that is recently been living in Austin. His family had moved to Austin. I think there were some personal connections that were formerly at TCU that might have also transferred to Texas that might have swayed his decision. And certainly there was speculation about NIL fueling that conversation. I don't have any evidence to really suggest that that was a huge motivating factor,
mm,
but it's pretty shocking, right? We did see that with Cam Mora going from UNC to Duke. Now you see Sebastian Gorsny going from TCU to Texas. It's hard to explain to the TCU fans for sure, and it will make the TCU Texas rivalry, which was already very spicy, just
yeah.
that much more spicy.
It's gonna be an interesting season to say the least, at least on the Big 12 side. And going into the conferences, and I do appreciate John for joining us. So make sure you are checking out his podcast, checking out his Twitter, everything like that. All the links to those are down in the description below. But before we get into the last segment, let's go over conference favorites or dark horses for this upcoming season. Now, it's
Okay.
really hard to narrow down who's where in college tennis now that we're in September and All Americans are currently happening while we're recording this video. And again, another proof to why it's so hard to talk about the spring when it's in the fall, even though the fall is continuously happening right now, but it's not showing the whole team. If we were to go over, and I'll start with Ivy League, and we'll make our way list down to the Power Five. Just
Okay.
quick fire, earliest of favorites, like too early top 25.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that caveat because
Yeah.
now more than ever, like some rosters are not even posted, right? Some commitments that they've announced,
Yeah.
you're not even sure they're on campus yet. Like there are so many more questions today than there ever were 10 years ago when it was just like, get the roster up. We saw last season with Carson Brandstein coming in at the very tail end. Like you should expect the unexpected, I think,
Yeah.
for college tennis. And so we are dealing with such limited information, it feels right now. So with that caveat in mind, let's name favorites.
let's name early favorites. Ivy League for the men.
I'm going to go Princeton. I think the Paul Inchauspy coming in as a sophomore season, he had a great fall season leading that team. For me, they are the pick.
They are the pick. What about for the men on the Big 12?
So it's a whole new Big 12. I would say Arizona State right now, assuming that Murphy Cassone and
Ooh.
Bor Artnik both return, that's a
Okay.
lethal top two.
That's a lethal top two. I like that pick. ACC.
I'm going to lean Wake right now. I feel like there's just too many players that they have on that roster. Virginia will be tough. Duke will be tough. Stanford, in a dream scenario where like everyone plays,
Yes.
would be a top contender, but you just can't bank on that.
Let's go ACC. We just did ACC. Excuse me. I don't know why I wrote that twice. Big Ten.
Ohio State.
Ohio State. That wasn't even a flinch. That. What about?
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say we didn't even talk about Ohio State as their transfer haul, right? I mean, they bring
Yeah.
in three really highly touted transfers in Will Jansen from North Carolina, Chris Lee, also from North Carolina, then from Tennessee, now at Ohio State, and then Aiden Kim from Florida. So certainly they lose their top three players in that singles lineup Ohio State does, but they replace them with three really great players as well.
SEC.
I would go Texas men.
Oh my God, I completely forgot Texas was in the
Yeah.
SEC.
It's a gauntlet.
When I said Big 12, I was like Texas or TCU, but now SEC is Texas. Oh
Yeah,
my
and Big
gosh.
12, I mean, I said Arizona State, but Arizona is now in the Big 12 too. So like those are the two Arizonas have a really good shot.
That's wild. And again, another team we haven't talked about with Arizona with Colton Smith.
Yeah.
What's their story going into the 2024-25 season? Because that's another team that you could look at and go, that could be a dark horse. Same with Illinois in the Big Ten. How many
Yeah.
more could we be missing?
Well, I have a list for you, but Arizona is on that dark horse list for sure. Colton Smith makes the NCAA semifinals. He really puts together a very strong summer, wins his first pro singles title. He and Jay Friend anchoring that top two. It's going to be really tough. They do lose a lot of senior experience from last season. They brought in a ton of freshmen. It's going to be a question of how many of those freshmen click for Arizona, but I really like Colton Smith's game. I think he can have a really big fall. The last team, I know I said Ohio State there quickly for Big Ten, but Michigan State's going to be really tough as well.
What do you think of Illinois?
I don't know if Illinois has the depth this season, but I
Okay.
think Ozalins, Kenta Miyoshi at top of that lineup will be very tough. I just don't know about the depth.
Okay. What are there any other teams from your dark horse list that we haven't mentioned?
No, not on the men's side.
Not on the men's side. What about if we go for the women? We'll go. Let me get rid of the ACC so that way I don't confuse myself again. Let's go SEC for the women.
This is brutal. This is absolutely brutal. I mean, the two best teams right now on the women's side are Georgia and Texas A&M.
Yeah.
The third team that could be the actual best team is Texas women. They bring in five freshmen. One is Maya Joint, who is 110 in the world right now. I don't think she's going to play the fall, so we'll have to wait to see her in the spring. but those three teams are potentially a
Lethal.
step above. Yeah, I'm putting Texas on the side just because it's made up of essentially all freshmen,
Yeah.
and we have to see how that works. But Texas A&M, Georgia women, to me, are a step above. Right now, I would say Georgia is my favorite to win
Okay.
the SEC title.
Big Ten.
So this one is interesting because now with the Big Ten schools, you have USC, you have UCLA.
Yep.
Previously, on the women's side, the Big Ten has been dominated by Michigan and Ohio State. I am UCLA curious this year, so I'm going to go
Okay.
UCLA women for the Big Ten.
What would be for the Big Ten for the women if we stayed there? Who would be your second if it wasn't UCLA? Because would it just be Michigan or Ohio State immediately?
No, I think it's USC. I think those four schools are clearly the four best schools in the Big Ten on the women's side this year. Now, I need to see more from USC, and I need to see how they're going to anchor the top of the lineup.
Mhm.
I think they have a really strong like 4, 5, and 6, but I feel like all their players are sort of in that range.
Yeah.
So I need to see more from the USC women. I don't think we're going to see 2023 NCAA singles champion Fang Tian come back for UCLA, but yeah, I mean Michigan's still going to be really good. They're going to have Fleekner, they're going to have Charney
Yeah.
still there, but they lost a lot of players.
Tian announced that she's going pro last year, didn't she?
Yeah, I mean that is what she would say, but again, this is why it always makes it so tough because UCLA wants her back for the spring.
Yeah.
There are things that they can now offer that they probably couldn't have offered years ago. And depending on how her fall goes, nothing is ever like a
Out of the
no
question.
out of the question. There you go. Yeah.
And I'm gonna bring this back to with the Carson debacle. Let's just say
Yeah.
that with what happened last year during NCAA's. Like
Mhm.
that was the biggest thing that happened. Would love to have her back on the channel to discuss it because I know you've talked to her about it with that decision.
I have not interviewed her about that decision. No.
You had a Twitter I'd call it discussion. That's the best
Yeah.
way I can put it.
Yeah. I mean, I tweeted something out about it for sure. It was
Yeah.
definitely a norm breaker, right?
Yes.
I
Good
think
way of
she
putting it.
commented on it on Twitter as well. To be clear, it is not a rule breaker. It
Yeah.
is just a norm breaker, and we
Yeah.
are becoming more and more accustomed to seeing these sort of norms broken over the
Yeah.
last few years. I would highly expect to see a few other schools employ a Carson strategy. It could
Mhm.
very well be Texas A&M, who still has an open scholarship spot on that roster.
Oh my. It's like history repeating itself
It
every
could very
time.
well be.
ACC?
So I think you lean Stanford here,
Yeah.
who's now in the ACC, who brings in Valerie Glosman, who outside of Maya Joint is certainly the top recruit in the country. They still bring back their seniors of Connie Ma,
Hmm.
Sasha Yepafanova, who is unfortunately injured this fall. They have a ton of talent on that Stanford team. UNC is taking a step back. I think they're not going to be as strong as they have been over the last decade and a half. Brantmeyer is still not playing, so she was hurt at indoors last season. I'm curious about the Duke women. They bring in
Okay.
a transfer, Elena Yu from Stanford.
Hmm.
It was a little bit of a rough season for them last year, but I think Stanford is the clear cut favorite on paper for the ACC.
Big 12?
Well, I first have to check myself on like now all these other
What's
schools,
the
but
realignment for the
yeah,
Big 12?
so for this actually, I think Oklahoma State on the women's side is really hurt by this realignment because there are no other top like 25 schools in the Big 12 now on the women's side. The Arizona schools are not that strong right now. BYU, not that strong. Houston, not that strong. They lose Oklahoma, they lose Texas. So Oklahoma State is by far and away the clear cut favorite for the Big 12 on the women's side.
I'm just looking at the schools and I'm just thinking to myself, which one could give them the biggest issues in
This is
conference?
now
I
at
I re
present
I
state.
can't tell you. I can't
Yeah.
tell you.
Well, you can't tell me because there isn't any, right? But the
Well,
Big
you didn't
12
have to
right
put it
now,
like that, but it maybe University of Houston, but it's still one of those where it's again up in the air. It's just
yeah.
they're that good where you don't like you're not going to see them play. It's going to sound mean. You're not going to see them play full potential until either out of conference or NCAAs.
Yeah, I mean that's what's going to happen, right? I mean that's typically what they've been doing. Like last season, you play a really tough non-conference, but at least in conference, you still have schools like Texas, like Oklahoma.
Yeah,
The Big 12 Women's Conference, of the 8 now Power 4 conferences, men and women's, is the worst conference.
fair enough. What about Ivy League? If we look at the Ivy League for the women, is there anyone that besides, let me hear your favorite first, please?
Mm-hmm. I would go Princeton.
Okay.
At some point, Princeton with the talent they have will deliver. But
Okay.
there's a few teams on the women's side in the Ivy League. Columbia has been recruiting very strongly.
Yeah.
Whether or not that translates to results will be something to watch. Harvard is usually in the mix as well. I would say right now, those are sort of your 3 teams on the women's side in the Ivy League.
Has the Ivy League for the women provided any pressure to the bigger conferences when it comes to national championship pedigree or individual championship pedigree?
It's a really good question because on the men's side, you've started to see the Ivy League continue to push up and up, right? This
Yeah.
year, Columbia having an NCAA singles finalist for the first time, making the Elite Eight for the first time. We have not really seen that on the women's side. You have
Yes.
seen players. You had Daria Freeman of Princeton reach number 1. You have had Princeton on the women's side be the team that's pushed towards a top 20 ranking.
Yeah.
Top 10 we have not had in my time covering tennis, so like the past 10-15 years.
That's fair. I think it's so interesting to see the difference between the men's and the women's when in starting with the Oklahoma State Big 12, like same thing. Men's side could be really good, women's side, it's a whole different story. And I think that's what's so interesting about college tennis in that regard too. It's never going to be the same pedigree on either side. Some, yes, but primarily no at the same time.
Yeah, I mean having a conference be have such a delta is definitely interesting,
Yeah.
right? I mean even when you have schools where the men's program is much better than the women's or vice versa, you sort of question why that is,
Mhm.
right? Because you think same resources, same schedule. But yeah, to have the Ivy League we'd have to do a deep dive on like why the women's Ivy League hasn't quite made the dent on the national stage as the men.
Yeah. And quick side note, Cornell too, with a top 10 ranking player and a couple in the top
Yeah.
100 is another Ivy League champion hopeful, I would say, as well with
Yeah, I
that
mean,
lineup.
yeah, the men's Ivy League is very strong this
Very
year. I mean,
strong.
Columbia is still going to be
The
probably a
team.
top 10 team.
Yep.
Princeton was my dark horse, and I went on the limb and said them. Cornell with Popaway at the top of that lineup.
Yep.
Like they have some depth this year in the Ivy League on the men's side.
I totally agree. And John, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Can we have a sneak peek of who you're having on next?
I don't have any interviews lined up, but that's because the results are going to dominate the conversation. So we will likely do a All Americans main draw preview when that drops. We'll talk about some of the players who have made deep runs in pre-qualifying and qualifying, and certainly throughout the fall, it's going to be the race to NCAAs. We'll probably have some players or coaches on who have deep results and probably try and monitor what the sentiment is about this new fall structure.
Okay.
And then I will be on the ground in Baylor for NCAA. So
Perfect.
always a lot to come.
Awesome. So, John, thank you so much. And while my dog is saying goodbye as well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. If you guys are new to the channel, make sure you're subscribed and notifications turned on and check out all of John's links down in the description below as well. And we will see you guys in the next one. Take care, guys. Thank you so much for watching.